Right?
Hi.
In light of Downton Abbey and others, and a TV watcher, can the Huntington ever do anything to improve the choices of content on American and English, which is my experience of English, content?
What, on television?
Your scholars and get them into Hollywood so that something can be changed.
So that's an interesting question. I was the first question that was asked of me during my interview after I gave my presentation on the relationship between master and servant at Arbury Hall in Warwickshire in the 1670s. And Randy will remember this. Susan Turner-Lowe, one of my colleagues who's Vice President for Communications, she's turned to me, she said, "Well, the story you've told us is so fascinating and the characters are so vivid. Have you ever thought of talking to a Hollywood screenwriter?" And I said, well, let's face it, if I don't get this job, there'll always be the film rights. So I didn't need to go down that track. It is interesting, I think, that the presence on British television of high-profile academics, faculty members, trying to make their research accessible to the wider public is much more prominent than is the case here. There is a real fashion for academic history presented in an accessible way on British TV, to the extent that in 2010, one major broadsheet newspaper, The Observer in England, talked about history as the new rock and roll in England, which I thought was quite interesting. I'd like to see more of it. Sometimes you find that faculty members are a bit sniffy about it. They don't want to be seen to be dumbing their work down or trivialising it. One of the things that the Huntington does extremely well, I think, through its communications office, is give scholars the opportunity to blog about the research that they are doing here. And the communications office has a wonderfully skilled editor called Kevin Durkin, who wins the confidence of scholars very, very easily. And in partnership with them, he helps them make their scholarship accessible. And if you've never seen the Huntington blog, it's called Verso. It's very well worth subscribing to it, because it's really highlights from the front line of the research programme, in which a scholar will share their research in a very accessible way with the wider interested public.
You got another question for Tom?
Am I Dr.? Okay.
That's all right.
I'm stealing the spotlight from my dad now. How can I help?
I first wanted to say I'm looking quite forward to meeting you and having a private talk with you sometime.
Okay.
I've had 40 years of high school students at San Marino High School, and having been one for 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
And I doubt that my peers, classmates, and all of the students I had, there were some, I'm sure, that could have perhaps been moved to England and been able to address an adult audience with poise and articulation that you have in class. I found it most refreshing and most impressed by it.
Thank you.
At some point, we'll discuss soccer and football.
Okay.
And I understand you're playing baseball, is that correct?
I did play for a couple of years, but this year I was going to, but then 4 AP classes happened. So.
I was looking forward to come out and watching you play. Anyway, well, in that case, that's part of my question about your participation in the various sports.
Well,
what it was like for you and so forth.
Well, so my freshman year I did soccer and baseball, and I played baseball in sophomore year as well. But the San Marino soccer program has really been the big one for me. I don't know how many of you are familiar with San Marino soccer, and if you aren't, that's for good reason, because we usually suck. I had a debate with Bill Plaschke, journalist, writer for the LA Times, and I was at a journalism conference, and my question that I wanted to debate with him was, will soccer ever be a success in the United States? And me, of course, yes, let's go, soccer, I love it. He said, no, all the great athletes who would play soccer go to play wide receiver for the Green Bay Packers or point guard for the Los Angeles Lakers. And in a sense, he's right. And that's kind of what happens at San Marino High School. You have a number of good soccer players, but they're better football players, they're better basketball players. So I don't want to make excuses, but you're working from a limited pool from the start. My freshman and sophomore years, I had a bit of an interesting experience of kind of yo-yoing between varsity and JV. I've spent all 3 years thus far practicing with varsity, but my soccer coach my freshman year, in no uncertain terms, basically told me, "Tom, you are not big enough to play varsity." Which, I mean, at first I was not very happy with, and Dad can support that, but it actually was a valuable experience to kind of move up through the ranks, and this year has just been an amazing season. We made CIF for the first time in over a decade, and we just had a lot of great players, but mostly the thing that was so special about this season is that we had 18 guys on the roster who genuinely liked each other. And my freshman and sophomore years, they were kind of cliquey, you know, the seniors stick together and they kind of give the freshmen a hard time. But this year, there was a family around it. And that's really what made the difference for me this year. And that's why we won that first playoff game in CIF against the team that was the number 3 seeded team in the whole CIF Southern section. We had no right to win that game. We had no right to win that game. They'd won the whole thing, I think, 2 years prior to this year. Ridiculously good school. 4 players committed to playing college. Whereas we have 1 player committed to playing college, and that is JP Shofi, who is going to play football at Yale. But it was an amazing game to be a part of. I said when I came home that that was the best night of my life. And that was for good reason, because I am never going to be involved in a sports team that was as exciting, as fun, or as passionate as that. Okay.
Any more questions for Steve Wartog?
Question for Steve. You talk about bringing 200, 300, or 400 scholars here in a year. And I know working with you, Liz and I have had the pleasure of having some of them stay as guests at our house.
Right.
That was wonderful. On the other hand, we've had to say no to a large number because we just don't have room.
Right.
I was wondering about how you house that number and what your future plans in that regard are.
Thank you for asking, Dennis. If there is anything that keeps me awake at night as Director of Research, it's the housing issue. How are we going to accommodate 200 scholars, 22, 23 of whom are here for the full academic year, the remainder for periods of 3 months or less? It's a real challenge. My office keeps a list of available accommodation, apartments, rooms and houses that we make available to scholars, and essentially we stand between prospective tenants and landlords, facilitating that conversation. It's very, very difficult to keep track of that available accommodation, and we certainly don't have the staff resources to operate anything like a booking system. So this is a system that was fit for purpose when the Research Fellowship Programme was about 1/3 of the size that it is. We are immensely grateful to those people, some of them here in this room this evening, who are very happy to rent their rooms or apartments or houses to Huntington Research Fellows when they wouldn't contemplate putting them up for rent on the open market. And that's one measure of your dedication to and support for the institution, and we're very grateful. But I'm worried about a whole series of things. I'm worried about pressure on numbers and pressure on availability. I'm worried about liability. What happens if the landlady turns out to be a nymphomaniac? What happens if the research fellow turns out to be a kleptomaniac? You know, there are any number of difficulties that could arise from this situation, and I don't want to end up in court about it. So there needs to be a more radical solution to the housing problem. Some of you may know how the Getty Research Institute, which is one of our sister institutions, solves this problem. They have a residential centre for their scholars in residence for the whole year. And that serves the purpose not only of making it a very attractive fellowship to hold, because housing comes as part of the package, but it also means that my equivalent number at the GRI, at the Getty Research Institute, finds it much easier to build a scholarly community amongst those scholars in residence, because they're living with one another. And I know that better fences sometimes make better neighbours, and you can be sick of one another after living cheek by jowl for a year, but I think it would really make a critical difference to the success of the Huntington Research Programme if there was purpose-built housing for scholars through which we could rotate our research fellows as they came for a year or for shorter periods. But I don't think there is any easy and certainly any inexpensive solution to this problem. It's a great question.
I have a question about your comment on
Digitisation.
That it is not something that excites you much. However, you also mentioned that making those 69,000 books and more available to available to researchers.
Yes.
Couldn't your philosophy on collaborating as scientists and making the collection available to the world through digitization go together? Right,
that's a very, very interesting question. So we certainly do want to make the material available to scholars. And the whole point of the Research Fellowship Programme is to do that. The argument for digitising our collections would be much stronger if we didn't have $2 million a year to give away to scholars to come here and physically look at them. That's not to say that we don't digitise at all. We often digitise to conserve and to protect, especially our very valuable or extremely rare or very